was supposed to be a normal ride home, just like every other ride I'd ever taken. I'd been out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania with a couple of friends just having a casual night at the bar, and now I was headed home. But that ride back, the one I thought would be boring and uneventful, it ended up being one of the creepiest, most unsettling things I've ever experienced, something that I still can't explain. I had spent the night in Lancaster with a couple of friends. The place we went to was a small local bar called the Lancaster Tap Room, a cozy, low-key spot that everyone in the area seemed to know. It was a typical Friday night, a little busy but not overcrowded. The kind of place where you could just hang out and have a drink without feeling rushed. But after a few beers and catching up with some old friends, I knew it was time to head home. The weather outside was cold, and a crisp chill filled the air. It was early November, and the wind was biting. I stepped out of the bar and wrapped my jacket tighter around me, glancing down at my phone. My friends were already gone, and I was alone, standing on the corner of King Street, waiting for my Uber. Now, if you've ever been to Lancaster, you know it's a quiet little town, especially at night. King Street is usually filled with people, but tonight, the streetlights flickered, and the streets were eerily quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing in the chilly air. Most people had already gone home for the night, and the only cars on the road were the occasional late-night drivers speeding by. I pulled up the Uber app and hit the button to request a ride. It wasn't long before I saw the familiar map showing a car approaching my location. I waited, checking my phone again, tapping my foot to stay warm. Then after a couple of minutes, I saw the headlights of a car coming toward me. It wasn't a sleek, shiny car like you'd expect for a luxury ride. It was an older Toyota Camry, maybe a 2009 model. Nothing fancy, but still clean enough to be a decent ride. The car slowed down and stopped right in front of me. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. "Hey, how's it going?" I said, giving the driver a quick smile. But the driver didn't respond. I thought it was a little odd. Usually the driver would say something like, "Hey, how are you?" or "Where are we headed?" But there was no response. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was tired or not in the mood for small talk. It was late after all. The car smelled faintly of cigarettes, which wasn't unusual for older vehicles. I didn't mind it too much, but it did make the air feel heavier. I got comfortable and buckled my seatbelt, staring out the window as we started driving. As we made our way through the streets of Lancaster, the city looked different. Normally, it's lively, even late at night. But tonight, it felt quiet, almost deserted. The lights flickered on the street, casting long, eerie shadows. The buildings looked like they had been there for decades, standing still and almost forgotten in the dark. I glanced at the driver. He had a dark hoodie on, and his face was mostly obscured by the rearview mirror. His hands gripped the wheel tight, but his eyes didn't look at me. They were focused straight ahead. I don't know what it was, but there was something about his posture that seemed wrong. It wasn't that he was driving strangely. No, the car was moving just fine, but there was something in the way he held himself, like he wasn't entirely present. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I'd taken hundreds of Uber rides and nothing ever happened. It was a Friday night. The guy was probably just tired, just like me, so I sat back and let the ride continue. The streets of Lancaster were unfamiliar in this quiet hour. The main roads were usually busy, but tonight, there was no one else around. I started to notice the small things. The houses lining the streets, dark and uninviting. The dim glow of the streetlights barely lit the way. There was something off about it. I couldn't quite place it, but it made my stomach twist. I looked at the GPS on my phone to check the route. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first, just the usual way I took to get home. But then, something weird happened. We passed my street, and then we passed another street I knew, and another. "Hey, you missed my place," I said, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge to my voice now. "My house is back there." No response. I said it again, louder this time. "Hey, you missed my place. Turn around, you've gone too far." The silence in the car was suffocating. I tried to see the driver's face, but the rearview mirror was angled just enough that I couldn't get a clear look. The streetlights outside barely lit the inside of the car, casting strange shadows across his face. I couldn't make out any details. His eyes were still fixed straight ahead, and he didn't acknowledge me at all. It was like I wasn't even there. My heart started racing. Now, I wasn't just annoyed, I was scared. I'd been on rides before where drivers made a wrong turn or took a weird route, but they always acknowledged it and turned around. This guy? Nothing. He was just driving, like I didn't even exist. I checked the app on my phone again. We were moving farther away from my neighborhood, but deeper into the suburbs where I didn't recognize the roads. The streets were darker, the houses farther apart. The eerie feeling in my gut grew stronger, like something wasn't right. This wasn't just a mistake. This felt deliberate. "Hey, stop the car," I said, my voice shaking now. "I need to get out." I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, trying to get it open, but it wouldn't budge. "Stop the car," I yelled. "Let me out!" But the driver didn't respond. His hands were still gripping the wheel, his eyes still fixed ahead. We were now on a road I'd never seen before. The streetlights were few and far between, and the trees along the side of the road were so thick they blocked out the moonlight. It felt like we were being swallowed up by the dark. "Let me out," I screamed, banging on the window, trying to get his attention. But he didn't even flinch. It was like I wasn't there at all. My heart was pounding in my chest. Panic set in, and I started feeling the walls closing in on me. This wasn't just a weird ride anymore. Something was wrong, and I needed to get out of there. Fast. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car came to a stop. The engine idled, and everything went silent. The car was now surrounded by trees, and I couldn't see any houses. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine. "Why are we stopped?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I was too scared to raise it any higher. The driver slowly turned his head toward me, and I swear the moment our eyes met, I felt like I was staring into an abyss. His eyes were hollow, dark, lifeless. There was no emotion in them, no warmth, no human connection. Just emptiness. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in years. A chill ran down my spine. What did he mean? What did he know? "Let me out of here," I demanded, starting to panic again. "Please, just let me go. I don't know where I am, but you need to turn around." But he didn't move. He just stared at me, that awful empty stare. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide and twisted, like something you'd see in a nightmare. I opened the door again, desperately trying to escape. This time, it worked. The car door clicked open, and I jumped out of the car without thinking. I didn't look back, didn't wait. I just ran as fast as I could, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get away from that car, from him. I didn't stop running until I found a house with its porch light on. I knocked on the door, panicking, and a kind woman opened it. I must have looked like a mess. I was out of breath, shaking, my heart still racing. I begged her to call the police, and she did. The police eventually found the car, but there was no sign of the driver. No traces, no clues, just an empty car parked on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I never saw that guy again, never got an explanation. I don't know if he was a real Uber driver or if something darker had taken over his body. But I do know this, I'm never taking another Uber in Lancaster again, especially not late at night. Some things just aren't worth the risk. Some roads, some rides are better left untaken. It started out like any other normal ride, but by the time I reached my destination, I was convinced that I had narrowly escaped becoming the next victim of one of the most notorious serial killers in recent history. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid or if I had stumbled into something that was too awful to even comprehend. But looking back, I'm certain of one thing. I never should have gotten in that car. It was late on a Friday evening in the middle of June. I had just wrapped up a long day of work in downtown Denver and was eager to get home. I was tired, mentally drained, and just wanted to kick back with some takeout and relax. The Uber app showed that a ride was just around the corner, so I tapped the confirm button and waited. A few minutes later, the map showed that a silver Honda Accord was pulling up in front of me. The weather was warm and the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the busy street. I walked toward the car, the soft hum of traffic filling the air, and opened the back door. "Hey, how's it going?" I said, settling into the back seat. The driver looked up at me, and for a brief second, I froze. There was something about his face that made my stomach twist. He had the kind of features you would forget the moment you looked away. Nothing remarkable about him. Average height, a scruffy beard, and short, dark hair. But his eyes, there was something about his eyes. Cold, calculating, with a glint that sent a shiver up my spine. I shrugged it off as just a bad vibe. It wasn't uncommon to feel a little uneasy when getting into a stranger's car, especially after a long day. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. "Where are we headed?" the driver asked, his voice surprisingly calm, almost too calm. It was a generic question, something every driver asks, but there was a certain stiffness in his tone that made it feel rehearsed. "West 12th Avenue, just off Spear Boulevard," I said, giving him the address. He nodded and started driving. At first, the ride was uneventful. We cruised through the city streets, passing by the familiar downtown buildings and the occasional pedestrian out for an evening walk. But as we approached the edge of the city, I felt that creeping unease return. The atmosphere was starting to feel different. I glanced at the driver's face in the rearview mirror again, and this time, something hit me like a ton of bricks. He looked so familiar. I had seen that face before, and then it clicked. Not even a week ago, the news was flooded with coverage about a local serial killer. His face was plastered on every news outlet, every social media platform. The man who had been arrested for the murders of several young women across the state. His arrest had been the talk of Denver for days. His name was James Donovan, and his image was unforgettable. I remembered seeing his photo on the news, but I hadn't given it much thought until now. The driver in front of me had the same eyes, the same features, the same scruffy beard. Everything about him matched the photo that had been everywhere on TV. I tried to stay calm, thinking that maybe I was just overthinking things. There were plenty of people who looked alike, right? It could be a coincidence. But the longer I stared at him, the more convinced I became. I felt my heart rate pick up, my hands start to sweat. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not a coincidence. I was sitting in a car with the face of a man who had been involved in brutal killings. The man who was now behind bars, supposedly. But here he was in front of me acting like nothing was wrong. I had to know for sure. "Hey, do you mind if I ask you something?" I asked, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the slight tremor in my voice. "Sure. Go ahead," he replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "You look really familiar to me," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I swear I've seen you somewhere." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave a small chuckle, but it didn't sound genuine. It sounded forced, uncomfortable. "You must be mistaken," he said, shaking his head a little. "I'm just a regular guy, nothing special about me." But the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His voice was a little too quick, too eager to brush it off. "I don't know," I continued, trying to act like I wasn't completely freaking out. "You really do look like someone I've seen on TV. You know that serial killer they arrested last week? James Donovan?" His hands tightened on the steering wheel for a moment. The muscles in his jaw tensed, and for a split second, I thought he might snap and do something crazy. He was silent, and the air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. "Look," he said after a long pause, "you're wrong. I'm not him, okay? I'm just trying to get through this shift like everyone else." But his response was so fast, so defensive, that it only made me more suspicious. Why was he getting so worked up? Before I could ask anything else, the driver suddenly pulled off the main road and took a sharp turn down a side street I didn't recognize. "Wait, what are you doing?" I asked, startled by the sudden change in direction. "Taking a shortcut," he replied quickly, not looking at me. "This way's faster. Trust me." I had lived in Denver long enough to know that this wasn't the usual route to my apartment. We were driving through unfamiliar neighborhoods, passing houses that didn't seem like they belonged anywhere near my destination. The streets were darker here, the houses seemed empty, and the further we went, the more isolated everything felt. My nerves were on edge now. My phone's GPS was still active, but the route on the map was no longer matching the one the driver was taking. I pulled out my phone, double-checking the app, but the moment I tried to pull up the map, the driver reached over and turned off the tracking app without a word. "Wait, what are you doing?" I said, my voice rising. "Turn it back on." He shot me a cold glance in the rearview mirror. "We don't need it. Just relax." The way he said that, so calm, so certain, sent a chill down my spine. My gut told me something wasn't right. This guy was hiding something, and it wasn't just the look on his face or the way he acted. It was the way he was controlling the situation. First, the silence when I mentioned the killer, then the detour, and now, turning off the app so I couldn't see where we were going. I was starting to panic. "Let me out of the car," I said, my voice shaking with fear. "Stop the car right now." The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving. My mind raced. Should I try to call for help? Should I jump out of the car? But the streets were too empty. It was too late for anyone to hear me. "Please, stop," I begged, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." He didn't say a word. But after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed down. We were no longer in an unfamiliar neighborhood. In fact, we were back in a more populated area, right near my place. I didn't waste any time. As soon as the car stopped, I didn't even wait for him to turn off the engine. I threw open the door, ran across the street, and didn't stop until I reached the nearest apartment building. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding. I didn't care what the driver thought or whether he followed me. I just needed to get away. I immediately called a friend and then the police. I explained the situation as best I could, but when the authorities tried to track down the car, they couldn't find it. There were no reports of an Uber driver matching his description, no trace of him or the car. It was like he had vanished. The police looked into the Rideshare app and the driver's profile, but it seemed like everything was legitimate. No criminal record, no reason to suspect foul play. But there was no way that was just a coincidence. No way that driver wasn't the man they had arrested just days earlier. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe I was just imagining it, maybe it was all paranoia. But the look in his eyes, the way he acted, it was real. And I'm convinced that I was only a few seconds away from something far worse. It was 1978, and I had just arrived in Riga, Latvia. I had been traveling around Europe for a few months, taking in the sights, like meeting new people, and generally enjoying my time abroad. But Latvia felt different. It was still under Soviet control, and there was something about it that made it feel like time had slowed down there. The air felt heavier, the streets quieter. I was visiting as part of a work assignment, and I'd heard stories about how strict things were under the Soviet regime, but nothing had prepared me for what happened during my late-night ride through Riga. I had been staying at a small hotel near the center of Riga, a modest place with creaky wooden floors and an old-fashioned charm. The staff was nice enough, though the atmosphere in the city had always seemed strangely tense, as if everyone was constantly on edge. It wasn't uncommon for people to whisper when they thought no one was listening, and sometimes the shadows of plainclothes police officers seemed to follow you down the streets. I had been out for dinner, a meal of hearty Latvian food with a couple of colleagues. It was a chilly evening, with a light drizzle hanging in the air, making the cobblestone streets slick and reflective. The city seemed almost magical in the foggy light. I had planned to walk back to my hotel, but my legs were tired and the drizzle was picking up, so I decided to take a cab. The Soviet era hadn't exactly made things easy in Latvia, and it wasn't as if rideshare apps or any of the conveniences of the West existed here in 1978. The best I could do was flag down a yellow taxi, a beat-up, old Soviet-made Volga that had seen better days. When I got into the car, I didn't think much of it. I was tired from a long day, and the driver, an older man with gray hair and a thick, bushy mustache, didn't speak a word of English. I could understand a bit of Russian, enough to make out some basic phrases, so I told him the name of the hotel where I was staying. He nodded, then started the car without a word. At first, the ride felt uneventful. The streets of Riga were quiet, the city mostly deserted as the evening wore on. The dim streetlights cast long shadows on the walls of the old buildings, and I could hear the low hum of the car's engine as it sputtered down the slick streets. The car smelled of old leather, tobacco, and a faint trace of something metallic. But then, after a few minutes, something about the driver started to feel strange. His eyes. They never left the road. He drove carefully, but there was an intensity in his gaze that didn't match the calmness of the drive. The silence in the car was thick, and I could feel my own heartbeat starting to pick up. I wasn't sure what it was, but I had this nagging feeling that something was wrong. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, and his jaw was tight. It was as if he was driving too deliberately, as if he knew exactly where he was going, but had no intention of telling me. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the growing discomfort. The road twisted through the older parts of the city, and I could see the outlines of buildings I didn't recognize. We were definitely heading in a direction that didn't match the usual route to my hotel. I glanced over at the driver, and his eyes flickered toward me for a second. There was something in them, a hint of recognition, maybe. But when I tried to meet his gaze, he quickly looked back at the road. I sat up straighter, now acutely aware of the unfamiliar neighborhood. The buildings were starting to look older, more rundown. We were in a part of town that seemed deserted, with few people around. There was an eerie quiet in the air, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I tried to focus on the buildings, to ground myself in something familiar, but the fog and the heavy rain made it impossible to make out any landmarks. Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "This isn't the usual way." The driver didn't answer. He just drove on, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. The silence in the car grew even heavier, the only sound being the steady hum of the engine and the soft tap of the rain on the windows. I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't bring myself to speak again. Maybe it was just a longer route. Maybe he was taking a different way to avoid traffic. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. We took another turn, and now we were driving down an even darker, narrower street. The buildings were smaller, older. There was something off about the neighborhood, like something had been abandoned here long ago and no one had bothered to clean it up. The fog was thicker now, and the lights from the street lamps barely reached the ground. It was as if the world outside the car had disappeared. And then, without warning, the driver turned off the headlights. I froze. The darkness inside the car became almost suffocating. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. The car crept forward slowly, but I could no longer make out anything outside. The street was pitch black. The driver kept his eyes on the road, still not speaking. I tried to calm myself, but fear was creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure if I was just overreacting or if something was truly wrong, but I felt trapped. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. What kind of taxi driver turns off their headlights in the middle of the night? What kind of driver keeps their passenger in complete darkness? "Stop the car," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "Stop the car. I need to get out." The driver didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. The car rolled on, slower now, and I could feel the temperature inside dropping. It was freezing, and I was starting to shiver. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but the cold seeped through. And then, just as I was about to shout at him again, the car came to an abrupt stop. I looked out the window, trying to see where we were, but there was nothing, just the black void of the night. The driver still didn't speak. He simply sat there, staring straight ahead. I didn't know what to do. The street was deserted, and there were no other cars around. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. The whole situation felt wrong. Too wrong. I had to get out. I opened the door before the driver could react and jumped out of the car, my heart racing. The rain hit my face as I ran, not even looking back to see if he was following. I didn't care. I just ran until I found the nearest streetlight and saw some people walking down the road. I found my way back to a more populated area and immediately hailed another cab. The driver of the second cab seemed normal enough, but I didn't relax until I was safe. I never believed in conspiracy theories. I didn't think much of it when people whispered about strange codes or secret handshakes. But on a dark night in Chicago, I learned that sometimes the world is more twisted than we can ever imagine. It was a cold evening in early December, and I was just finishing up a long business trip. I had spent the last few days bouncing from meetings to conferences and was looking forward to heading home. My flight was delayed, so by the time I landed at O'Hare Airport, it was well past midnight. I just wanted to get to my hotel, grab some food, and crash for the night. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber. It wasn't the usual time to be taking a ride, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted to relax. The app showed that my ride would be here in 5 minutes, so I sat down on one of the benches near the curb, scrolling through my emails as I waited. A few minutes later, I saw the familiar headlights of a black SUV pulling up. It was a big, unmarked vehicle, a Dodge Durango. I didn't think much of it at first. I opened the door and got inside. "Hey, how's it going?" I said, trying to be friendly, but the driver didn't respond. He just nodded and gave me a quick glance in the rearview mirror. His eyes were hidden by the shadow of the dashboard, and the low lighting in the car made it hard to get a good look at him. His expression was neutral, almost unreadable. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't exactly warm either. I settled into the back seat, feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe I was just exhausted from the long trip, but something about the driver made me uneasy. As we pulled out of the airport, the car was surprisingly quiet. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, noting that the route seemed to be taking us in the right direction. We were heading toward the north side of the city, where my hotel was located. But then, something caught my attention. The driver was tapping his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 then a slight pause, followed by another tap, tap, tap. It was a consistent rhythm, and it seemed like every time we passed another car on the road, the tapping grew more pronounced. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just some odd habit the driver had. Maybe he was just drumming to the beat of some invisible tune in his head. But the more I noticed it, the more it unsettled me. We drove through the empty streets, passing by only a few other cars. Chicago's late-night traffic was lighter than usual, but every time we passed another vehicle, the driver would tap the wheel, always the same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Each time I became more aware of it, and the hairs on the back of my neck started to rise. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. As we reached a quiet neighborhood, something even stranger happened. A car began tailing us, following us from a few car lengths behind. I hadn't noticed it at first, but it became more obvious when the headlights of the car kept flickering in and out, almost like the driver was intentionally dimming their lights. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. His hands were still tapping out the same rhythmic pattern on the steering wheel. He didn't look back at the car behind us, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. The rhythmic tapping had a different energy now, more urgent, more deliberate. It was as if he was sending a signal to the car behind us. I couldn't quite make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a message. It wasn't until the car behind us started to gain on us, getting closer and closer, that I began to panic. My heart was racing in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. My mind flashed to worst-case scenarios. Was I being followed? Was I in some kind of danger? The car behind us was now too close for comfort, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. I leaned forward, trying to see what kind of car it was, but I couldn't make it out in the dark. Then, suddenly, the driver in the front seat whispered under his breath, so quietly that I almost didn't catch it. "They're here." My blood ran cold. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt like my breath had been stolen from me. Who was he talking about? Who was here? I wanted to ask him, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The tension in the car was suffocating, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to jump out of the car and run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The car behind us was still tailing us, its headlights almost blinding now. I watched as the driver calmly turned the corner onto a quieter street, driving at a slow pace. The car behind us followed, just as the tapping on the steering wheel continued. Tap, 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 each rhythm getting faster, more insistent. The moment we turned down the side street, the car behind us did the same. My panic reached new heights. I knew then that this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't a random driver or a random car. It felt like something calculated, something planned. I leaned forward again, my voice shaky. "What's going on?" I asked, barely above a whisper, The driver didn't answer at first. He just kept driving, his hands still tapping, but now it was almost as though he was in a trance, lost in his own rhythm. He took another turn, and this time we ended up in a completely unfamiliar area. The streets were narrow, dimly lit, and the few buildings around us looked abandoned. I didn't recognize this part of the city at all. Then, suddenly, without warning, the car in front of us stopped. The driver slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. I barely had time to register what was happening before I heard the engine cut off, and the driver turned to face me, his eyes cold and detached. His lips parted slightly, revealing a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "You're just a part of the plan." At that moment, I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of that car. Without a second thought, I flung open the door and bolted out into the street, running as fast as I could. I didn't stop to look back. My heart was pounding in my chest and my thoughts were jumbled, but I kept running, not stopping until I reached a well-lit street filled with people. I hailed another cab as quickly as I could, my body still trembling, my mind racing. I told the new driver to take me to the nearest police station. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I wasn't safe. The next morning, I tried to piece it all together. I couldn't find any trace of the driver or the car I had been in. The app didn't show any record of the ride. There was no record of a black Dodge Durango picking me up, no indication of anything suspicious. But the memory of that rhythmic tapping, the whispered words, and the feeling of being hunted, it stayed with me. I never took an Uber at night again, and to this day, I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that sometimes, when you're out there in the world's hidden corners, you don't always know who or what is following you. You know when you're on edge, but you brush it off because it's late, you're tired, and your mind is just overthinking things? That's what I told myself as I tried to ignore the discomfort I felt during my Uber ride home in Mexico. But looking back, I should have trusted my instincts. What I thought was a simple, annoying situation quickly turned into something I'll never forget. It was 10:30 p.m. on a warm Friday night in late September, and I was finally heading home after a long day. I had been traveling with my two kids, Eva and Lucas, for the last week, exploring the beaches of Puerto Vallarta, a beautiful coastal town on Mexico's Pacific coast. We'd had an amazing time, but by the end of the trip, I was more than ready to get back to the quiet of my house. After the airport shuttle dropped us off at the terminal, I called an Uber to take us back to our Airbnb, a small but charming place in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city center. I was exhausted, the kids were too, and all I wanted was to grab some quick dinner and fall asleep. The only thing I needed was to get our bags into the house and get us all settled. The Uber arrived after a few minutes of waiting under the dim streetlights outside the terminal. The car was an older model Honda, a little scratched up, but nothing unusual for a budget ride. I loaded my bags into the trunk, handed the driver my address, and hopped into the back with the kids. "Buenas noches." The driver greeted me with a smile, his accent heavy, but friendly. "Where are we headed?" "Back to my place, just outside the city," I said, giving him the address. I didn't pay much attention to his appearance at first. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning gray hair and a bit of a gut hanging over his belt. His dark shirt was unbuttoned at the top, and his hands gripped the steering wheel as he began to drive. The kids were surprisingly quiet, probably just as tired as I was, and I let them rest their heads on the back seat, staring out the window as the city slowly passed us by. The lights from the buildings and the street lamps flickered by in a blur as we made our way down the quieter, more residential streets. As we drove, I noticed the driver kept looking at me through the rearview mirror. Not in a way that made me feel threatened, but more like he was studying me. He had an intense look on his face that I couldn't quite figure out. His eyes were dark, and there was something about his expression, almost like he recognized me, but I couldn't figure out from where. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. After all, it was already late, and I hadn't had much sleep in the last few days. We turned down my street, and I pointed toward the house, ready to get out. But then, as the car stopped in front of the house, the driver did something strange. He didn't just sit there waiting for me to gather my things. He immediately got out of the car and walked around to the trunk. "Can I help you with your bags?" he asked, his voice friendly but insistent. I blinked, surprised. "Oh no, I've got it," I said, a little unsure. I had traveled with two small children and had a fair number of bags, but I didn't want some stranger coming inside my house. The driver smiled, though, and held up his hands. No, let me help. You have children. I insist." Something about the insistence rubbed me the wrong way, but I didn't want to make a scene. So I reluctantly handed him the larger suitcase, trying to manage the smaller bags on my own. But as I grabbed the door handle, ready to lead the way inside, I noticed something. The driver was looking at me again, his eyes narrowed slightly as though he was studying my every move. "Are you sure?" I asked, feeling the need to double-check. "You really don't have to." "It's no trouble at all," he interrupted, stepping around me and heading up the front steps to the door with my suitcase in his hand. "I've been doing this for a long time." I felt a little more uncomfortable now, but I brushed it off. He was just trying to be polite, right? Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, this wasn't a big deal. I unlocked the door and led the way inside, the kids trailing behind me. When I turned around to grab my bags, I saw that the driver had already stepped into the hallway and was looking around like he was familiar with the space. Could you just leave the bags by the door?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a strange sensation crawling up my spine. He didn't need to come inside. The house wasn't big, and I could easily handle the bags. But instead of stopping in the entryway like I expected, the driver walked further into the house, heading down the hallway without saying a word. I quickly glanced at my kids, who were sitting on the couch, eyes wide, clearly tired but alert. Excuse me?" I called out, my voice now a little firmer. "I didn't ask for you to come in." The driver stopped at the door of the living room, his eyes sweeping over the room as if he were making himself at home. "Sorry, I just thought I could put the bags in the living room for you. And you wouldn't want to carry them all the way to your bedroom." I felt my pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. I could see him looking around now, his eyes flicking over the furniture, the paintings on the walls, the family pictures. His gaze lingered on the window, where the curtains were drawn just enough to let in the dim light from outside. I didn't know how to explain it, but it felt like he was too comfortable, too familiar with the space, like he had been inside before. "No, that's fine. Thank you," I said, moving toward him and trying to gently push him out the door. "We can take care of it. Thank you, but..." I stopped mid-sentence. As I walked toward him, I saw that he was looking directly at the photo on the wall next to the door. It was a picture of my family, from the trip we had taken a few years ago. My husband, kids, and I standing on a beach in front of a large rock formation in La Paz, Mexico. The driver's eyes lingered on the photo for a long time, too long. "You've been to La Paz?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer, almost too casual. I froze. Yes, we were there a couple of years ago." He nodded slowly, as if processing the information. Then he looked at me, his gaze sharp now, no longer friendly or polite. "It's a beautiful place," he said, his voice lower. "I've been there too. Beautiful beaches, yes, but I prefer the quiet places." His words sent a chill down my spine. How did he know? How could he know where the photo was taken? I glanced at the photo again, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. It was a pretty common tourist spot. But why did it feel like he had been to this house before? Why did it feel like he knew the layout? Why did his gaze keep drifting toward the staircase that led upstairs? The stairs where my children's bedrooms were. I stepped forward and put a hand on his arm, trying to guide him back to the door. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said, my voice now firm. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes unreadable, before giving me a polite smile. "Of course, Senora. I'm sorry for the intrusion." He turned to leave, and I followed him out the door, watching as he walked back to the car. I slammed the door behind me and immediately locked it, leaning against it for support as my heartbeat slowed down. But as I stood there, trying to calm myself down, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had never told him I was from La Paz. I had never mentioned that particular photo. No one could have known about the family photo on the wall or the exact layout of the house unless they had been here before. I checked the windows and doors again, making sure everything was locked. The kids were already fast asleep by the time I got back to the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I don't know who that driver was or how he knew so much about my house, but one thing's for sure, I won't be taking an Uber again anytime soon. Some people have no boundaries, and some things are better left unexplored. As a police officer, you hear a lot of things, you see a lot of things, but there's one incident that still haunts me to this day, and something that happened in the middle of the night in a sleepy town that I'll never forget. What started as a routine night shift turned into a nightmare that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. I'm telling you this because, as a cop, I've been trained to deal with all kinds of situations. But this was something else. It was a late summer night in 2016 in a small town about 30 miles outside of Portland, Oregon. I had just finished a long shift, nothing out of the ordinary. A few noise complaints, a minor car accident, some routine patrolling, the usual. The air was still warm, and the hum of cicadas filled the night as I made my way back to the station, just a couple of miles from the city limits. I was exhausted, but it was my last round before I could go home and get some rest. As I was passing by a popular bar on the corner of Maple and Oak, I noticed an Uber pulling out of the parking lot. It caught my attention because I could see the headlights reflecting off the wet pavement, which was unusual for that time of night. I thought nothing of it, until I saw the same car turn onto a back road I knew led to a desolate stretch of highway that no one in their right mind would be driving down at 2 a.m. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to follow it. I turned on my lights, not intending to pull the car over yet, just to see if it was taking a wrong turn. Maybe the driver was lost. No big deal, just part of the job. But the moment I began following the car, it didn't slow down. In fact, it sped up, almost like it was trying to get away from me. I flicked on the siren, the hum of the siren cutting through the still night air. The car in front of me didn't pull over, though. It kept going, accelerating, turning onto that stretch of highway I mentioned. I was starting to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right, and my gut was telling me I needed to be cautious. This wasn't the usual night shift nonsense. Something was off. Finally, the car pulled over to the side of the road just as I was about to get close. I parked behind it, getting out of the car and walking toward the Uber. I wasn't expecting much. Probably just some confused driver or a driver trying to take a shortcut, but I was about to find out how wrong I was. I knocked on the window and the driver rolled it down slowly, a tired, almost reluctant expression on his face. He was a middle-aged guy, average build, wearing a baseball cap and a t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked at me for a second before he spoke. "Everything okay, officer?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something off about it. I couldn't place it at first. "Yeah, I was just wondering why you were speeding down this stretch of highway," I said, trying to keep things professional. "Not a lot of cars come down here at this time of night, especially an Uber." "Are you lost?" "No," he replied quickly, a little too quickly. "Just heading to a drop-off. I'm fine, officer." I raised an eyebrow. There was something in the way he spoke that made my instincts flare up. He seemed too relaxed, like he wasn't nervous at all. Most people would be a little more jumpy when an officer pulls them over in the middle of the night. All right, I said, still unsure about the situation. "Mind if I take a look at your license and registration?" The driver handed me his ID without hesitation, and as I scanned it, something caught my attention. His name, Mark Hollis. I didn't recognize it at first, but the moment I read the name, a chill ran down my spine. I've been in law enforcement long enough to remember the details, and this name rang a bell. Mark Hollis had been in the news a year earlier. He was connected to a string of disappearances in nearby towns. People had started to notice, but there was no proof, no evidence. The cases had gone cold. I quickly glanced back at him, feeling the weight of recognition hit me hard. "Is there something you're not telling me, Mr. Hollis?" I asked, my voice more pointed now. He smirked, just a small curl of his lips. I told you, officer, I'm just doing my job. I didn't trust him. Not for a second. My gut was screaming at me that something was wrong, and I wasn't about to let him drive off without further questioning. As I stood there, trying to piece together the information, something caught my attention. A man in the back seat of the car, just barely visible through the tinted windows. I felt a knot in my stomach. The man in the back was staring at me, and I could see his eyes gleaming in the dark. Something about the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. He was too calm, too still. Almost as if he knew something I didn't. He wasn't supposed to be there. I hadn't seen him get in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, I said, my hand hovering over my radio, ready to call for backup. Mark Hollis didn't move. The man in the back didn't move either. The whole car seemed frozen in place. I don't think you understand, officer, Mark said slowly, his voice low, almost menacing now. I've been here before. You might not remember me, but I know you. I know exactly who you are. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. His words were chilling, and for a second, I couldn't understand what he meant. I was just about to press for more information when the man in the back seat moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift, but it was enough to send a ripple of dread through me. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a whisper from the back of the car. "They're watching," the man said, his voice cold and deliberate. "They've always been watching." That's when I realized. This wasn't just some random Uber ride. This wasn't a routine stop. The eerie silence, the way Mark knew who I was, the presence in the back seat, it all clicked. I wasn't dealing with just a driver. I was dealing with someone who had been lurking in the shadows for a long time. I immediately radioed for backup, my voice sharp and commanding. But the moment I turned my attention away, Mark's hand darted to something on the passenger seat. Before I could react, he threw a quick motion, and I was temporarily blinded by a flash of light. The next few minutes were a blur. When my backup arrived, the car was empty, and Mark and the man in the back seat had vanished without a trace. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, except for the lingering feeling that something was off. The license and registration were gone. Even the ID Mark had handed me was nowhere to be found. I never saw them again, and the cases from a year ago remained unsolved. But the one thing I learned that night was something I'll never forget. No matter how routine your night shift seems, you never really know who or what you're dealing with. Sometimes the people you least expect have been there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike.